What was the right approach? What would work? What would not blow up the world?
A conclusion was reached, not to bomb, but to blockade. The Navy would stop and search all ships heading for Cuba. They called it a quarantine.
It was believed that the quarantine would convey to Khrushchev the determination of the president to see that those missiles were removed without stimulating a military response.
But in case the quarantine didn't work, preparations were made for airstrikes, and a massive American invasion force was made ready. President Kennedy was in Chicago. Now he was needed in Washington. The press were growing suspicious.
I was called by President Kennedy at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he said, "Come to my room." And he still had his bathrobe on, and he said, "Here's something I'm writing for you. You're going to hold a press conference to announce it."
The assistant White House physician, Dr. George Berkeley, noticed that the president's voice was very husky. This morning, when he examined the president, he found the president had developed a slight temperature and that he was suffering from a minor upper respiratory ailment. The president therefore canceled his schedule for the rest of today and tomorrow and has returned to Washington and the White House.
About halfway to Washington, I suddenly found myself alone with Kennedy in the front part of the airplane. I said, "Mr. President, you're not sick. What the hell's going on?" He said to me, "You're going to find out as soon as you land in Washington, and then grab your balls."
Good morning, everyone. An unusual flurry of top-secret military and diplomatic activity over the weekend has Washington guessing today that a major move in American foreign policy may be imminent. The speculation centers on the Caribbean and possible action against Cuba.
That afternoon, the Soviet ambassador was called to an urgent meeting with Secretary of State Dean Rusk.
Rusk said, "You are delivering missiles to Cuba. We have aerial reconnaissance photographs. This is a threat to our security, and we cannot possibly allow it. In 1 hour's time, at 7 p.m., the President will make a radio and television appeal to the American people, where he will describe the situation. At the same time, he wants you to pass the message on to Khrushchev."
At 7 o'clock, Kennedy announced to the world for the first time the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba, and that a blockade was now in force.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction.
The first response from Moscow came the next morning. Khrushchev was not going to back down.
Kennedy spoke about quarantine, and that sounded as something not very precise, perhaps not a blockade as it actually was. So the first reactions were pretty tough from the Soviet side.
Denouncing the United States arms quarantine against Cuba as a step toward world thermonuclear war, the Soviet Union today ordered its armed forces into a state of combat readiness, and forces of the Warsaw Pact, the communist counterpart of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, immediately followed suit.
As the superpowers prepared for conflict, Cuba announced a combat alarm. Over 250,000 people stood by to repel an American invasion.
We felt the danger. This was war. The country could be invaded at any time by the Americans.
If they invaded our country, I was convinced it would create the grave risk of the U.S. taking the second step of carrying out a nuclear airstrike against the Soviet Union.
The American fleet now encircled Cuba. The Soviet ships stayed on course. With confrontation imminent, Kennedy wanted direct contact with Moscow. He sent his brother Robert to meet in secret with the Soviet ambassador.
He said, "Did your government instruct the captains to turn the ships back home because Kennedy introduced the quarantine?" I said, "No, our captains have no such orders. And as far as I'm aware, they are instructed to go on to Cuba." According to international law, you have no right to stop our ships in the open sea. You cannot draw an imaginary line which cannot be crossed. It is against the law. He replied, "Well then, I don't know where we are heading."
The Pentagon says the United States is ready to sink every communist bloc ship headed for Cuba which refuses to stop and be searched under the blockade. Further, force will be used if necessary to stop and search any ship of any nation bound for Cuba.
I think that was the moment that really was the heart stopper. I recall being in the newsroom, just waiting for that next bulletin and almost literally trying to type with my fingers crossed.
Let's check over at the Pentagon with Charles von Fremd on that. Chuck, is there any late information about the position of those Soviet ships or what might be happening to them?
Walter, we haven't heard a word for several hours now as to when the confrontation between U.S. vessels and the Soviet ships will come about.
Nerves were being stretched to breaking point. People tried to prepare for a possible nuclear holocaust. A wave of panic buying swept across America.
We have a utility room where the furnaces are, and we were wondering whether we could make that into a bomb shelter of some form. We were learning for the first time the time that we would have after the explosion before the fumes, the killing heat and so forth would reach us.
The Soviet leaders had tried to keep the crisis from their people, but the news was getting out.
The people felt the breath of war and were tense. I remember my parents felt doomed. They understood that war would not be like it was before, that it would be a war with atomic bombs.
This is a special report from CBS News.
At its beginning, this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and American warships on the sea lanes leading to Cuba. But there has been no confrontation as far as we know, and some hope has been generated by suggestions of negotiation.
Almost at the last moment, the missile ships appeared to have slowed down or altered course. That evening, as Kennedy dined with friends at the White House, a toast was proposed to celebrate. Kennedy declined. The game, he said, was hardly over. At 9:24 p.m., the State Department received a letter from Khrushchev for the president. Khrushchev rejected all of Kennedy's demands. The missiles already in Cuba were being prepared for action. For the first time in its history, America's Strategic Air Command moved to Defense Condition 2. The next step, DEFCON 1, would be war. Just after dawn on the morning of the 25th, Kennedy ordered the interception of the Bucharest, a ship carrying Soviet oil. He knew there was no possibility of an oil tanker carrying missiles, but it was a signal to Khrushchev that he was deadly serious. That afternoon at the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson confronted his Soviet counterpart, Ambassador Zorin.
All right, sir.